We all are only 1 degree removed from knowing someone who is being impacted by workplace violence or some form of online exploitation. This issue filters into employee wellness, impacting engagement at work. Let's bridge this gap by bringing awareness and education to these pressing issues and shield the vulnerable. All right, everybody, welcome back to Shield the Vulnerable, Untold Stories. I have got an amazing guest with us here today. It is Anna Jane, or AJ Edmonds. AJ, you are a Canadian filmmaker based out of Los Angeles, and you are the director and producer of the Dark Highway documentary. And we're going to dive into that today, but a little bit more about you. You're an actress, you're a producer. You were born in Kingston, Ontario. You grew up right near the Kingston Penitentiary, which for anybody listening is a maximum security prison. And you got your introduction into the filmmaking world when you were 14. You started doing some work with a high school friend who was making a feature about bullying, and you worked on other documentaries with him. But you said you were a self-proclaimed musical theater kid, and you've always been a performer.
That's very true. And it might be self-proclaimed, but anyone that knows me knows that I lead with jazz hands.
Yeah.
So I'm a musical theater kid when you can hear me coming,
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I've had the opportunity to view a screening of The Dark Highway, and it was an absolutely amazing and unreal film production that you put together, like just very emotionally gripping. I felt a lot of emotion myself watching it, from everything from anger to inspiration and everything in between. It was so well done. For any of our listeners, if you're not from the Ontario, Canada area, the Dark Highway is in reference to Highway 401. Highway 401 is the busiest highway in North America. It's not the longest highway by any means, but it's the busiest highway in North America. And it runs from Windsor, Ontario, which is right on the Detroit, Michigan border, all the way to Quebec. And it stops in every single major city across Ontario. And it is a human trafficking corridor, hence the name The Dark Highway. The whole film features the lived experiences of sex trafficking survivors, those who were lured, groomed, and trafficked for the purposes of sexual exploitation in Canada and internationally. And we know human trafficking takes on many forms outside of sex trafficking as well, but that was the focus of the film. But AJ, you had said prior to doing this film, you had no prior experience, no knowledge of the human trafficking world. What opened your eyes to it? Like, how did you get involved with such an amazing project?
Yeah, I had no idea. I was your average bystander that, grew up, like you said, in Kingston, which is a city that is cut by the 401. I spent a lot of my childhood going to Toronto, where my family was, or going to London, where my grandparents were, or even going to Windsor and Niagara, like all of these places. I lived across the 401 and did so very comfortably, with no suggestion or fear that there was something happening around me that I just couldn't see. And so it really was. I was talking to another producer who was thinking about this topic and how it can be impactful as a film. And they had asked me if I would support them in the research around it. And I was struck, once I started researching, how accessible the information was. Once you know to ask the right question, like, where does human trafficking happen in Ontario? Mm-hmm. All of a sudden I was learning just how real it was, and how it's invisible, but it's not completely hidden. And, once I knew to ask the question, and I knew to sort of open my eyes to this as a crime that was happening around me and around my nieces and nephews, and historically around everyone that touches the highway, I went, well, now that I know, I can't pretend I don't. And I felt a very intense responsibility for two reasons. One was, once I knew what was happening, I wanted to know where I could invest energy to support the awareness and education and be a part of learning myself. And then also through the research, I was connected with these incredible people who hold, in my opinion, the keys to really understanding this crime, which was Kelly Talon Franklin and Katerina McLeod, who are the two first individuals I got to speak with, who are legacy survivors. They are experiential leaders based on lived experience. And once I got to know them and I heard the work they were doing and what they had survived themselves, and then the people that they invest their life in supporting exiting years later. I learned so much from them during the research that I felt very responsible to continue on the journey of bringing this film forward and not holding on to all of this information I now had in my own head, and building a team to get it out into the world with Dark Highway.
God, I have so many questions.
Great.
So, so you started on the research aspect and you learned this information, and you're right. Once you know it, you can't unknow it. You can't, and almost like morally, you can't turn a blind eye to it and say, I can't contribute to a solution with this, right? And I think the way in which you tell your story and you feature the story with survivors, like you said, with Kelly Talon Franklin and everybody else that was involved in this documentary, that had to be, even just going through that for yourself, had to be emotionally draining or inspirational at the same time. Like there's a lot that goes into that. Like I can't, from a filmmaking perspective, and you're trying to learn all of this and say, how am I going to tell this in story format?
Yeah,
That can educate.
I'm from a very unique framework. My family is very diverse in the way we were raised. So my parents were both very international people. My dad volunteered with the Red Cross. He went into disaster zones and worked on restructuring environments after a natural disaster. My mom worked in disability rights and physiotherapy in war zones. So I had an acute awareness of how challenging the world around us is, and how nothing is perfect. And so I had seen things in my life growing up that not everybody has access to seeing. I traveled a lot. I was in post-conflict zones when I was very young. And so not to suggest that I am desensitized to tough situations. I was just raised in an environment where I was aware that the world can be quite dark. And the one thing I've always learned, and I learned this from my mother and my father, and then I've really learned it from Kelly and Kat and all the other incredible survivors, is you have to have hope. And when you see other people who have been directly affected by a crime or by a disaster and they can hold on to hope, then I will also have hope. And I will also lean into finding the pieces of continuing to push on, because they are as well. And, to do that as a filmmaker, you have to put a team together that when you feel like you are drained, they will fill the rest of the cup. So I was very fortunate. I am very fortunate to have in my life Gina Simone, who's one of my best friends. She's an exceptional director herself and a producer. And then on top of that, she's also an editor. And so I brought her on very early on, and I kind of bamboozled her because I said we were going to do a short film, which was much more enticing because we were like, yeah, it'll just be a couple months. It's been almost 4.5 years. But, between the two of us, like we were close friends, but to do this, we had to share a lot of emotional weight amongst us because she grew up in Brampton. And, Brampton is also an offshoot of the 401. And she grew up in a very different environment than me. Brampton being a much busier, much more densely populated part of Ontario than, say, Kingston was. And so she had a very different interaction with the topic of human trafficking, even though she didn't know about it growing up. But, when we started learning more about where it was impacting, she knew the high schools in Caledon that we were learning about that had been impacted by the crime. And so between the two of us, and our dogs, we found a lot of sharing of the moments when things got too tough. And when I would get really angry, she would balance it out and we would, go for a walk, or we would be able to talk about it. And then also, like I mentioned before, when you create a community around something you're doing and you gain the trust of individuals who are willing to come forward, they also show up for you. Like Gina and I were not alone. Like Kelly and Kat were checking in, and, they would ask us, if you have any questions, if you need to take a break, like they were these incredible teammates to us throughout it. And that was really important as we were making this film. It's not super traditional to, as a filmmaker, include the subjects. A lot of people will say there's a lot of risk to that. There's a lot of, what if they back out? What if they don't like it? What if they don't want to do it anymore? And Gina and I knew early on that we were not willing to risk further exploitation of individuals who have been exploited. And the only way that we knew how to do that was to keep them involved at every single stage. They knew the questions we were asking before we ever showed up. I had been talking to them for months before we met in person. So when we showed up on our shoot day, we were almost like old friends. Like we knew what we were talking about. We knew where we were going. And I think you see that in the movie, is there's a comfort in the way that the interviews are conducted. Some people I'm even on screen with, because that's what felt really comfortable, was for us to share a space and make it less of an investigation. It was never my intention for this to feel like some sort of investigation. This was I, as a bystander, as a Canadian citizen, an Ontario resident, am discovering something, and I want everyone that watches this movie to discover it with me. Yeah. And that was a huge part of this journey.
Yeah. You said, so when you set out to do it, right, you're talking about, and you said the word earlier, an invisible thing. And it's like it's hidden in plain sight. What were the biggest things, like your biggest, as you're learning more about the human trafficking world, and that how, often in terms it's like it's clandestine, meaning it's like it's unspoken of, it's unheard of, it's just not known, it's very secretive, but it's not. It's like it's happening in front of us. As you became more aware of it, did you start to see it?
I mean, once you know about something, it's hard to not be consistently thinking about it and be aware, and start to ask more questions about situations. When I hear about colleagues or children of friends that are starting to develop, and I've got a couple friends that are now, they have their kids going into their teen years, which is crazy. I mean, I don't look like any of my friends could have teenagers. But like you start asking questions like what's their school life like? Yeah. What are they doing online? I have a niece that loves Roblox. I scour the internet to learn about the dangers of these sites that kids have access to, because now I'm aware at just how high the risk is. And, do I go through my day-to-day looking to assess a situation with the framework of, is someone being trafficked? No, I don't. And I think if I did, it would be a very challenging day to day. But I do ask a lot more questions now. I am much more aware when I feel like something might be unsafe, or if someone's, pushing the edges of a relationship with a friend of mine or a friend of a friend. And I'm also just so much more digitally well-versed now, because what we had in the 90s when I was a kid, you worried about getting snatched off the street. Like the internet was it was fresh. And now, the dangers are so much more accessible in even more hidden spaces. And so that has definitely started informing, digital advocacy and making sure to talk about, what parts of the internet kids are getting access to and all of that.
Yeah. And when you look at that, right, and you're talking about, you have friends that have teenage kids that are growing up now, when the average age of entry into human trafficking is 13 years. Okay, that's the average age, which means there has to be people that are older, and there has to be people that are younger.
And, for Indigenous youths, it's 8.
Yeah.
Average.
And 50% of human trafficking victims are from the Indigenous community.
Based on the statistics we have access to, and they only represent, Indigenous women only represent 4% of the Canadian population.
Right.
And so, there is a disproportionate overrepresentation of Indigenous, First Nation, and Métis communities within this crime. And it is gripping that it continues to grow, and that it happens truly anywhere you go. I think well, I know we have preconceived ideas of what human trafficking looks like. And, Liam Neeson made us all feel
Yeah,
like
it's not taken.
yeah, it's not, we're not going to have that be the staple. And the other preconceived notion that I found people had is that it only happened to people that were being brought into the country.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a myth that was dispelled almost immediately. Majority are born within Canada and within what we call
Yeah.
Canada. And that was a shake for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There definitely is those misconceptions, right? That one, it's an international crime, or that people, like you said, the Liam Neeson, they're being snatched, they're being put into shipping containers, or they're being kidnapped when they're traveling abroad. Do those things happen? Yes. But the bulk majority of it is it's homegrown. It's bred from within our own countries, right? And when you're talking about people, it's not human smuggling, right? And there is and people think that's what it is, because human smuggling, traditionally speaking, by definition, is if somebody is being smuggled as a human, they've consented to being transferred from one country to another and smuggled in. However, for those who are smuggled into a country, their risk factor does increase drastically, that when they land in that country, that they then can become a human trafficking victim. But so much of trafficking is just it's built right up within your own community. It can be very low level at the street and not sophisticated looking at all, to tied right into higher levels of organized crime. And
Yeah. I mean,
most,
there is a range, right? And when I went into making the film, I was really focused on how do I localize this for the average person? How do I make sure everyone understands that any of us can be vulnerable to it? Because vulnerabilities
mhm,
are nuanced.
very much.
Vulnerabilities range, and another preconceived idea was that it only happened to specific communities because of obvious vulnerabilities. And I learned pretty quickly that, a lot of these young girls, and it is overrepresented of females that get folded into this. Um, but there are also men, and I interview, a man in my film who was also trafficked as a teenager.
Mhm.
And, the vulnerability is as easy as, their dad is out of the picture, or their dad works a lot, or their mom isn't
Yeah.
present, or, like it can truly range. Two of the women I worked with were from relatively on the outside, normal nuclear families. Mom and dad both lived there. And they
Mhm.
were being trafficked during the school hours. Vulnerability is nuanced. And everything I learned was that we really have to assess how to make kids comfortable to talk about what's happening in their day to day.
And that's a huge part of it. And we have to talk to kids about it. You can't,
Mhm.
again, you said you're a child of the 90s, right? Me too. Growing up, born in the 80s, grew up as a youth in the 90s. And it's like a lot of these topics didn't even exist, or conversations didn't have to be had. And now more and more, when you're talking about Indigenous youth at 8 years old being introduced into trafficking, the average age is 13 years old. Conversations, whether it's happening at the parental level or at the school level and coming through, school-based education, is that kids need to understand that this happens. And it's not just like here one day and you're being trafficked tomorrow. It is a slow buildup of the trafficker earning your trust, of them then learning how to exploit those vulnerabilities and take advantage of you to the point where somebody feels as though they cannot say no. That debt bondage is created, or whatever else is there for them to be able to exploit them. And youth need to understand this, because this happens over 3 months. Those barriers are broken down, and then it's like you're trapped in it before you even realize that you're caught in a trap.
What I learned throughout the research was truly that the people that know what's happening, and this, Jackie Linder said it, Kelly said it, is that kids know. All kids know what's happening with their friends. And, I had asked Jackie throughout the process, like, why don't kids come forward? Like, surely this feels dangerous. And it's, in her words, the cost of disclosure. You know, if
Feeling like
in
they breached that trust.
Yeah. And what happens when you, well, either breach of trust with a friend, or like, what are the consequences of telling an adult that you're doing something that you know you're not supposed to? And, you know, I believe Jackie gave me the stat that it's like over 90% of kids that are being sexually abused don't disclose, but there are adults absolutely everywhere for them to tell. But there's a cost that they know without, I don't know if someone's saying it or if it's just this sort of, we have this feeling like, you know, you're doing something wrong, you don't want to admit to it. But like, that's a huge stat for children. And
Mm-hmm.
so, you know, I kept asking, like, why aren't we talking? And all Jackie kept saying, and Kelly really reinforced it, is one, we got to make safe spaces for kids to be able to talk. Find a person they're not afraid to say something to because they know they're not going to get in trouble, like an aunt, a social worker, the mom of a friend, you know, like who are the safe adults. And then, you know, for me, as an aunt, I sat back and reflected and went, how do I make sure I'm a safe adult for all of the kids in my life? You know, because
Mm-hmm.
we have to look inward and we have to decide, you know, if a kid comes forward and discloses something that
Yeah.
is outside of our comfort zone based on the framework that we were raised, how will I react? And how do I make sure I react in a way that doesn't send whoever's coming forward further away from wanting to disclose anything else? And that, for me, it's not a small thing to assess, right? Because we have to be able to have these conversations and not put anybody down. And that was something I
Yeah.
really, really learned from Jackie. You know, like,
It
we got to be safer for kids.
it's so interesting that you say that. So I recorded a podcast the other day with a lady. When she grew up, she was trafficked by her family. Um, through from her grandfather, her mother, and her older sister, all played a part in it. And she really held this in until she was an adult. And the first time she reported, which was going on now 40 years ago, um, she reported it to a doctor looking for help. She was called a liar by her doctor. She went to a mental health clinic and reported to a therapist. She was solely seeking help. She was called a liar, right? And when you just, you know, with talking to Kelly and Kat and everything, and that we need safe places. And that's one of the biggest things for anybody who's reporting is like, if somebody comes to you with this information, it's no judgment. I'm here to listen and I'm here to offer support. But you have to take your own opinion out of it, your own beliefs out of it. Because as soon as you make somebody feel unsafe, they're going to shut down. And that's just going to, it has the potential to lead them deeper into the trafficking or where they won't escape from it.
And that's a great point. And one thing I learned from the individuals I had the incredible opportunity to work with is that is why, especially in the space of human trafficking, survivor leaders are absolutely the people you need at the table,
Mm-hmm.
because they know, even if it's a different type of trafficking, even if they can't relate directly to what has happened specifically to each survivor. It's, when I was doing my research, I couldn't get over how I was seeing all these interviews with survivors, but it would be these sound bites of what they lived through. What was it
Mm-hmm.
like to be trafficked? How were you trafficked? Where were you trafficked? And it's almost like we think that, well, no, I won't say that. It's not we think collectively. What it felt like from a research perspective is that we look to people who have survived the crime in the silos of just the crime. Very rarely was it, you know, what was happening before. And then also what happens after you decide to exit. Because that piece, I couldn't find anything about. It was almost
Right.
like if they decide to leave, life goes back to normal, everything is hunky dory, and we move on. And so as I was piecing the film together, I kept going, it's really easy to know it happens. It just is. Once you put it out on the internet, where is human trafficking happening? You know.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like you have to go into the deep recesses of the dark web. It's there. There are incredible journalists doing their job, pulling these stories and these stats forward. There are people working in this space, but the people that are having the impact on the ground for people that need direct, accessible, non-judgmental care are survivors. And
Mm-hmm.
I was so curious as I was curating the way this film would unfold with Gina. I kept going, what can you not find by just Googling human trafficking? What information do I have to provide with people? And some of it was sound bites. It was like, how can I give people just a piece to walk away from and feel like they can use that soundbite? The fact that it takes almost twice as long to put a trafficking case through the criminal court system as it does other violent crimes was shocking to me. The fact that you require a victim statement to push through the system is shocking to me. The fact that we are not assessing what happens after an exit, not necessarily even 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years later. Life is different. These individuals don't go back to the way it was before because they can't. And those are the things that Gina and I kept looking for. What are the questions people don't even know to ask? What happens when you want to exit? Where do you end up first? How do you? Who do you talk to? Who do you trust? The young woman in the film talks about how you're supposed to go to the police, and yet some of the people that were buying her were police officers. These were the questions I kept pushing, like, why, what are we missing in these conversations? And those answers really came from Kelly and Michelle and Kat and the incredible mother and daughter that came forward, and the young girl, and Robin and Jessica, and all these incredible people that were willing to trust me with their lived experience to jump into what really happens.
And that was told so beautifully in the documentary, to really hear from them and connect to it. Like I said, I think AJ, for the first 15 minutes, and I mean, I've worked in law enforcement. I've been exposed. I worked in intelligence, human trafficking. I felt anger, that anger turned to inspiration to see other ways to tackle this issue, and to hear from trafficking survivors and who are using their story now to have an impact on their communities, and to be a voice for those who don't feel like they have a voice, and to start to teach other people on how to best approach somebody who may disclose to you that they're being a victim of human trafficking. Because I can tell you right now, like, when people make that disclosure to you, it's been happening for a long time in most cases. I don't want to paint everything with the same brush, but it takes people a long time to get to that point where they feel as though they can safely exit. And the way in which you capture the story of every single individual in Dark Highway was so wonderfully done. I truly felt connected to each person through the film.
Well, thank you. That as a filmmaker, there's nothing more I could ever want. And, I had never made a feature doc before. Gina and I had done a bunch of short documentaries about a variety of topics. And this one has been such an incredible journey as a human being, as someone that now, I feel like I've been given this information that I get to carry with me for the rest of my life and continue to educate myself about it, because, as you and I have been talking, this is an ever moving target. And, with every change of government, every change of any guard in any of the sectors that impact this crime, comes more nuances. And, I had hoped when we finished the movie, you never know what's happening. As a filmmaker, you're like, I'm just going to do it. My head's in it. This is my life. And, for the last 4 years, it really has been. I have been gifted this opportunity to continue working with these incredible women and see the film get used to train and to get sent to high schools and to engage with social workers. And the other thing Gina and I were very sensitive about in making the film was we didn't want anyone that works in the field or is adjacent to the field or knew about the crime but didn't know what to do to feel like they were being put down for perhaps not having the right approach to engaging with the information and the crime and engaging with survivors. And a lot of the social workers I spoke to and the social services that came forward have all echoed the things that the survivors I worked with were saying, was that the resources just aren't there. They didn't know there isn't enough training. There isn't enough access to really be able to have a full picture on how to engage when someone discloses, or how to engage when you think a trafficking situation is happening, but no one is disclosing. Right. Kelly talks a lot about this in the work she does, is what happens in the hospitals and in emergency rooms. And, my biggest takeaway from all of this is truly at the very core, the individuals we need to be handing the batons to guide us through how to really understand and not just understand and not just prevent, because prevention is huge. That's usually the first question anybody asks me, is how do we stop it? But it's also how to help if you think someone's being trafficked, but also what to do after. What does the aftercare look like? Where do you show up for people? And really the individuals that hold that information are survivors, and the survivor leaders that spend their life really tirelessly finding ways to end this crime.
Yeah, they're dedicating their lives to it. They are. And so you are, I know, big question for me, I was going to be like, where can I see Dark Highway? How can I see it? I know it's not publicly available yet, but how are you're currently pairing this with training, with Courage for Freedom.
Yes, we're very lucky. We're doing an impact campaign. So the film is paired with training. Having seen it, that you can walk away from this movie feeling all sorts of emotions. And it's been important to us that with this initial rollout, we are pairing it with something that allows you to learn a little bit more. I'm a filmmaker. I am not an expert. I didn't make a movie that was meant to represent any sort of expertise. It is just the start of a conversation. And so how do we start the conversation with a film and then lean into giving people the real life tools? And that's exactly what's happening. So Kelly and her organization, Courage for Freedom, are using the film with her training, and it's being taken across Canada, which is very cool. We've had the opportunity to be in front of lots of different children's aids, victim services, couple of high schools, which is, I'm going to be honest with you, the most nerve-wracking place to have your film screened is for teenagers. I don't care what kind of movie you've made. It is so terrifying. I was more nervous for that screening than any other screening we've had.
No kidding.
But yeah, Kelly's support and trust in Gina and I, and then continued partnership in making sure that not only the film Gina and I have been working on for 4 years gets seen by as many people as possible, but also seeing it have legs in a way that can actually have hopefully a long-term effect is one of the coolest things as a filmmaker that I ever could have envisioned. And I'm so grateful. Yeah. And then our plan afterwards is to make sure that it's accessible to everybody, because that's the other thing is after festivals, I've been humbled by the amount of messages I get saying, I want to show it to my kids. I want to show it to my parents. And so that's the business of filmmaking. And we're hopefully getting really close to having it on a distribution platform that will be accessible to a broader audience.
Yeah, that's amazing. It was filmed in a way, it's timeless. It's not just relevant today. It's going to be relevant tomorrow. It's going to be relevant next week. I mean, hopefully it's not relevant in the future. Hopefully we've ended human trafficking one day, right? Modern day slavery. but it was filmed in a way that no matter what that timeline is for that release, it's going to be very well received by anybody. And it's such a
Well,
useful
thank you.
tool to connect people. I think even from an awareness standpoint, to just understand most people cannot drive to and from work without passing a house, a motel, somewhere where it's happening. It is that close to us. We are all 1 or 2 degrees removed from probably knowing somebody who's been impacted by these things. And I think the more we can burst that bubble, not make it a taboo topic to talk about and raise more awareness and get more people on board to just recognizing it, knowing what to do, we'll start to make greater strides with everything. So, AJ, where can people find you? They want to learn more about you. If somebody were to go to a website and want to see an awesome Cap and Crunch commercial that you were in, or any of your other work, I got to look through your website and see other work that you're doing. Like, you do so much more beyond this, right? And it was really cool to kind of see the other commercials and everything you've been in. Where can people find you, just to connect and learn a little bit more about you, the film, and everything?
Yeah, I do have a website. It's my name, AJAneEdmonds.com. So there you get a whole smattering of things I've produced and commercials I've had the opportunity to be in, and films. In terms of social media, if that's your thing, it's at A to the JE or Dark Highway Film. That's another one. My co-producer Gina, it's her name, Gina Simone. And yeah, the two of us work very closely together. So if you're looking for me and you find her, it's not hard to find each other through one another's work. So yeah, I'm out there.
Amazing. I know I just referenced the Cap and Crunch commercial. She is so much more than that. There's so much work on there, but I told her, I was like, I saw this commercial. I'm like, I haven't seen a Cap and Crunch commercial since I was a kid. I'm like, that was awesome.
There we are.
There you are.
I was fighting the soggies.
There you go. That's amazing. Thank you so much. I know how busy you are. I know how important this topic is to you. Thank you for taking the time out to
Thanks, Dave.
Interview with us, to talk to our guests. For anybody who's listening, if you learned something today, if you had any insights, if you know anybody who may need to hear this message, start to share it. Share the podcast. Tell somebody about it. Share the message with people. Like I said, we're all 1 or 2 degrees removed from knowing somebody that this has been an impact on. And the more we can talk about it, the more we can break the barriers to it, and we can make huge strides towards ending this. I know that this podcast today was really focused on the Dark Highway and the impacts that this has in Ontario, Canada. It's happening in every province across Canada. It's happening in every single state across the United States, every single country. Right? It's there. So the messaging that you're taking from today, just know that you can apply it wherever it is that you are. There's victims out there that need our support. There's survivors out there that continue to need support. So just, you can do your due diligence, share the podcast, talk to people about it. And this has been another episode of Shield the Vulnerable, Untold Stories. AJ, thank you again for being here.
Thanks so much, Dave.